You're listening to the BBC World Service Space Podcast. We're going to tell you how to live, work, play and fight at the final frontier, as well as saluting some of history's space pioneers. Happy listening.
Station Houston on 2. Are you ready for the event?
Right now, at least 3 members of the human race are not on Earth because they are living and working in space.
Yeah, the sun's flashing off the solar rays and looks like it's winking at us. It's pretty neat.
I'm European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti. And until recently, I was living 400 kilometers above our planet, traveling in orbit at more than 27,000 kilometers per hour.
Turn on 2 for Dragon. Capture is complete. Go for fast capture reconfiguration.
I'm back on Earth now at the European Astronaut Center in Cologne, Germany. In A Home in Space, here on the BBC World Service, I'll be telling the story of the ISS, the International Space Station, a multinational, multilingual project that was first conceived more than 40 years ago. I'll be talking about life on board, the science on the space station, and its future. I'll also be asking whether our outpost in orbit has helped bring countries on Earth closer together.
Soon, I'll be able to look into the night sky and see our work up there, with the Big Dipper, the moon, and the stars.
Back in the late 1990s, the American Space Agency NASA was confident that the International Space Station would be worth waiting for.
NASA and its worldwide partners have launched the first stages of the International Space Station.
The first section of the space station, the Russian Zaryan module, was blasted into orbit on a Proton rocket in November 1998. At the time, plenty of people had their doubts about the project, as it was already delayed and over budget. David Baker, now editor of Spaceflight magazine for the British Interplanetary Society, was a NASA engineer working behind the scenes to sign up nations to the ISS program.
The idea of a space station goes way back. It goes back more than 100 years. And when the space program began in the late 1950s, indeed, that was the model that was chosen. That first we would put satellites into space and then men in space stations around the Earth and eventually onto the moon and the planets.
But before the space station had even been built, there was talk that the whole program might be abandoned. Astronaut Michael Barrett works at the NASA Johnson Space Center as the lead for payload science, and is a former manager of the Human Research Program there.
There were a lot of naysayers in the 90s, and there was a lot of questions as to why we should build a station at all. Why not take all of our resources and go to Mars? Or do some other space venture that wasn't requiring the difficulties of international cooperation? And I was involved in some of those discussions, and I'm very, very happy that we went the direction we did.
The story of how we ended up with a massive space station involving 11 European countries, as well as Canada, Japan, Russia, and the United States, goes back long before that first launch in 1998. Valerie Neal is the chair of the Space History Department at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.
NASA had in its earliest strategic plans the idea of launching humans into Earth orbit, then establishing a place for them in Earth orbit, and then using that space station to be a springboard to go on to the moon.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
But under the pressure of the early Soviet achievements in space, President Kennedy asked his advisors, what can we possibly do to beat the Russians into space? And the advisors didn't think that we could establish a space station more quickly, but they thought we had a really good chance to get to the moon more quickly than they. And so the 1-2-3 step-ladder approach became 1-3-2 in sequence.
By the 1970s, with the race to the moon won, an American space station was back on NASA's agenda. Only this time, the Soviet Union got there first.
As a top American official of NASA declared, this successful manning of Salyut is a major milestone in the exploration of space.
The first space station, Salyut 1, was launched on the 19th of April 1971. In June that year, the three-man crew of Soyuz 11 entered the 20-meter-long orbiting cylinder for the first time. They spent 3 weeks living and working in space, a new record.
The Russian news agency TASS described the achievement as solving for the first time the engineering, technical task of delivering a crew to an orbiting scientific station by a transport ship.
During the re-entry into the atmosphere, a faulty valve opened on the spacecraft. All the air was sucked out of the cabin. Without spacesuits, the crew was killed.
A recovery team on helicopter landed simultaneously and after opening the hatch, found the crew of the Soyuz 11 in their work positions without any signs of life.
With most of NASA's resources diverted into building the space shuttle, NASA managed to piece together a space station of its own, Skylab.
Valley, the Skylab. We got her in daylight at 1.5 miles, 29 feet per second. Roger, Pete, copy.
It was made of hollowed-out sections of enormous Saturn V rockets, left over after the Apollo moon landing program was cut short. Valerie Neal.
We're in Skylab. This is the backup unit to the Skylab that flew as the first U.S. space station in 1973 to 75. And compared to the Mercury, Gemini, and even the Apollo capsules, this was huge as a spacecraft. And we're standing right now in the area where we can look into the sleeping quarters, which was one small compartment, an actual bathroom in space. Astronauts prior to that time had to use plastic bags, basically. But here they had a full bathroom with a toilet and a little sink where they could wash up. There's a common area. And then there was a wardroom with a little table where they could have their meals together or do work projects together. There were 3 crewmen at a time on board. There's exercise equipment, a bicycle for cardiovascular exercise and also for some experiments. There's even a shower.
The original NASA concept of a space station came straight out of Kubrick's 2001, with all of those home comfort facilities that really are irrelevant in space and you just don't need. And Skylab was designed really to look like a 1G lab and workstation, where you had essentially your living quarters in the basement and the research, you went up the stairs to the ground floor, as it were. In space, you don't need that. And suddenly it became very clear when the concept of a space station went from a huge facility, launched by a big Saturn V perhaps, up to 10 metres across, to a very, very much smaller series of grouped modules, that you didn't need these areas. And guess what? It was the Russians that had discovered that 15 years earlier.
David Baker. But Skylab was a one-off, and by the 1980s, as Cold War tensions escalated, it looked like the Soviet Union was once again winning the space race. Bill Berry is NASA's chief historian.
In the 70s and the early 80s, the Soviets had the space station program going on. They were also building their own version of the shuttle and spending huge amounts of resources duplicating what the United States was doing with the space shuttle and building a number of military satellites as well. That caused a lot of concern in the West as to what their intentions were, and were they in fact outspending us in space? Were they doing more in space? And there were a number of news magazines in the early 80s that did cover stories on the United States falling behind in space again. So the stage had been set for the Reagan administration as they came in to make a major change in U.S. space policy and sort of do something extra in space to make the U.S. more competitive.
We can follow our dreams to distant stars, living and working in space for peaceful economic and scientific gain. Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade.
From the beginning, Space Station Freedom was designed as an international partnership. It would have contributions from Europe, Canada, and Japan. Sound familiar?
On both the Soviet side and the U.S. side in the 70s, there had been efforts to use the space program as a way to reach out to our allies and friends and to encourage people who were kind of on the edge of being our allies and friends to be more friendly with us. And so the space station becomes, in addition to a technical achievement and economic advantage and all those other scientific advantages to have to building a space station, it also becomes a foreign policy tool as well, as the space program has frequently been.
This is A Home in Space, here on the BBC World Service. With me, European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti. I'm examining the past, present, and future of the International Space Station, the ISS, which is orbiting some 400 kilometers above our heads and was my home for 200 days. I'm in the main training hall at the European Astronaut Center in Cologne. This is where we train all crew members of the International Space Station for the European components of the space station. So here you can see a mock-up of the Columbus Laboratory, the European Space Agency's facility on the ISS. Also, we have a mock-up of ATV, the Automated Transfer Vehicles. ESA provided 5 ATVs to the space station program, supplying each time over 7 tons of cargo to the ISS. And to my right, we can see a simulator of the Soyuz spacecraft. That's the Russian vehicle that took me and my crewmates to the space station and, of course, back to Earth.
And we have touchdown. You can see the reefing of the chute on the horizon. Touchdown at 8:44 a.m. Central Time, 7:44 p.m. at the landing site in Kazakhstan. The Expedition 43 crew, Terry Virts, Anton Shkaplerov, and Samantha Cristoforetti are back on Earth.
Throughout the 1980s, the Freedom space station design started to take shape, at least on paper. But it wasn't going well, and in Washington, political support for the project was wavering. Space historian Bill Berry.
The program was, by the end of the 80s and as the 90s began, behind schedule, over budget a bit. And then, of course, the Soviet Union implodes. Suddenly, you don't need Freedom space station to counter the Soviet space station anymore because there isn't a Soviet space. There's still a Mir space station, but it's a Russian space station. Now suddenly they're potentially our allies, and the momentum behind spending money to fix the problems with Freedom diminishes rapidly. And when the Clinton administration came in the early 90s, a plan was put forward to the administration saying, rather than it being Freedom and being a Western space station, why don't we make an international space station and bring the Russians on board, in part because it makes sense, and we can collaborate together on a lot of things. The Russians have lots of expertise that they can bring to the table. But also, there are lots of concerns after the Soviet Union collapsed about what are all those Russian rocket scientists going to do? So it also made sense from a non-proliferation perspective. So Freedom Space Station becomes an international space station, brings the Russians on board. A huge redesign effort happens. The expectation is that the redesign, because we're bringing the Russians on that have expertise, and they also have modules that they were already building for their Mir 2 space station that they can bring to bear, that in fact the cost of building the station will go down. So Freedom morphs from being a Cold War Western bastion in outer space to being a symbol of the new post-Cold War world where the United States, Europe, Japan, Canada, and the former Soviet Union all work together in space.
This program of political reform extended to the space industry. Energia, the organization that had built the world's first satellite, Sputnik, launched the first man and woman into space, and built the Mir space station, became a private business. And like any business, it needed money to operate.
We were beginning to get traction with the Clinton White House, saying this may not be a bad idea. And consequently, we're developing relations with the major contractors, Boeing, Rockwell at the time, McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed, but everybody was scared on the American side.
Jeffrey Member is chief executive of space company Nanorex and the author of a book on the space station called Selling Peace. He represented Energia in negotiations with the United States.
Then a decision was made politically. Why not send a Russian cosmonaut? It turned out to be Sergei Krikalev. He was an Energia astronaut to the shuttle. And then the Russians pushed it further, said, why don't we have the shuttle visit the Mir? In the space community, this was met with astonishment. The idea that the Energia docking system could be used to dock the shuttle with the Mir. But of course, the Soviets had the Buran, which was much like the space shuttle. That's a subject of another discussion. And so it grew. And it was received favorably as a wonderful sign of the times by the political folks in Washington. So we suddenly had the Mir shuttle program, as we called it on the Russian side, and the shuttle Mir program, and it took on a life of its own. The Russians said, you have to pay us. And there was great consternation. But for a variety of geopolitical reasons, the United States had forced the Soviets to pull out of a cryogenic engine deal with India. That was for about $500 million US. Well, gee, Shuttle Mir turned out to be about $500 million US. It's one of those funny coincidences we see in life. And so we went forward with the Mir Shuttle Mir program.
Space was an area where Russia and America shared common ground, and the missions to Mir proved that the two Cold War rivals could work together. It also proved once again that nothing about space travel should ever be considered routine. On June 25, 1997, while testing a docking procedure, a Progress resupply ship collided with the station.
A collision has damaged the Russian space station Mir, which has 3 crew on board.
The crew were prepared for immediate evacuation, but after a few minutes it became clear that there was no need to abandon Mir. The damaged solar panels mean that Mir has lost half of its power supply, and this raises serious questions about whether the station can continue.
I am Alexander Lazutkin. I was in space in 1997 on the Mir station, half year. В самом начале, во-первых, первые секунды.
When the collision happened with the Progress ship, the first thing we felt was the pressure dropping, and you feel it in your ears. It immediately tells you that oxygen is escaping. The next second you see the red light on the control panel beeping, indicating there's a problem. In this moment, you need to make a decision what to do, and the first thing is to locate where the leakage is taking place. So we located the module, and from then it was working together with the team, monitoring how quickly the pressure drops. That lets you know how long you have to fix the problem, and whether you can isolate the module where the leakage is taking place. This is what I did. The minute my hands started doing what they were trained to do, there was no problem. I knew exactly what needed to be done. We worked together. It was isolated, and we could continue with our mission.
By the late 1990s, the age of the space station Mir was often the subject of jokes, laughing at the Russians' expense. It was hardly fair. Space Station Freedom was barely off the drawing board.
As a program, it was in very difficult shape. It was done the usual way with a bunch of contractors. They were, I'm told, over budget. They were late. And then a new administrator came in, Dan Golden, and he admitted it. He said, nothing is being built. We have spent, I believe it was $8 billion US, and we have nothing to show for it.
Jeffrey Munber was at meetings where his Russian company Energia was increasingly finding common ground with the American contractors building the Freedom space station. Rather than building two separate space stations, Mir 2 and Freedom, a joint project seemed the next logical step.
They went off to Seattle secretly, the Energia officials, met with Boeing. They came up with the outline. I believe they went first to the brand new head of the Russian Space Agency, Koptiev, Yuri Koptiev. He endorsed it. He was excited. They took it to Dan Golden, who took it to Al Gore and said, this is good, who took it to Chernomyrdin, and voila, just like that, the Russians were part. And then somebody remembered we need to tell the Europeans. It was so fast, we couldn't believe it. Everything we had worked for. I visited the Soviet Union in 1989. I came back and said to everybody, why don't we just use the Russians? And suddenly, there was this period of time where it all fell into place. And we suddenly had the Russians as partners on a brand new space station program. Freedom was gone.
On January 29, 1998, representatives from 15 countries met in Washington to sign the agreement establishing the International Space Station, an equal, peaceful partnership between nations in space. Space historian Valerie Neal.
There was a strong sense that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The Soviets had been very successful with spaceflight. They had far more experience in long-duration spaceflight and in assembling and servicing a space station than the international partners did.
Страшно было, когда уже мы закрыли люк.
ISS is a legacy of Mir. So from a technical point of view, from the Russian side, there's nothing new. The modules which form the International Space Station, it's all been done already at Mir. But the international cooperation and our space industry working together with America and other space industries across the globe, This is the most important thing.
After that first launch in 1998, events started to move quickly. 2 years after Zarya was launched, on the 2nd of November 2000, 2 cosmonauts and a US astronaut, Bill Shepard, Yuri Gitzenko, and Sergei Krikalev, became the first crew to call the space station their home. Then, on February 1st, 2003, as Space Shuttle Columbia was returning to Earth, it broke apart during re-entry, killing all 7 astronauts on board.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check. Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
Former test pilot Eileen Collins is the first woman to pilot the space shuttle and its first female commander. After the Columbia explosion, she was scheduled to command the next mission to the International Space Station.
We had 3 main things that we had to do to get back to flying again. Stop foam from falling off the fuel tank was the first. The second was inspect, and the third was repair. But that very first one, stop the foam, we knew we couldn't stop all foam, but we could stop big pieces. Regardless, on my launch, a big piece of foam fell off on my launch. But this time we had cameras on the shuttle, so we saw it come off. Fortunately, it missed the wing, but it went right underneath the wing, and it could have hit us. It just goes to show you space is a dangerous place to fly, and you cannot control everything. But you can see why we retired the shuttle.
Eileen Collins' return to flight mission took place in 2005 with an American, Russian, and Japanese crew. The European Columbus Laboratory, which is where I did most of my science experiments, was added in 2008. In 2011, Michael Barratt's Space Shuttle mission, the last one for the shuttle Discovery, transported the final module to the space station.
If you look at the challenge of building something complex in space, and you take away the international aspect of it, it's dicey enough. You have lots of modules that you really can't ever put together on the ground before you send them all up and hope they fit. But in this case, it was built by many different countries. So we have modules built by the US, by Russia, by Japan, by Europe, and then we got the big robotic arm system from Canada. And we had to launch all of these things. They had to fit, they had to connect, they had to talk to one another with communication and data systems. And they did. When you look at that alone, it's amazing. We had to work across languages, across cultures, across systems. We use English. The Europeans use metric, as do the Russians. And we still made it work. So to me, that's the most astounding thing.
It was finally finished, our home in space. I'm European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, and still to come, I'll be discussing the science on the station and revealing my secrets of how to make the perfect cup of space station coffee. We'll also hear from my Italian astronaut colleague Luca Parmitano, who almost drowned during a spacewalk, and we'll look ahead to the future of the station and beyond. All that to come here on the BBC World Service in just a moment.
T-minus 10, 9.
Hi, this is European Space Agency astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti on the BBC World Service with A Home in Space, a program about my home for over 7 months until June 2015, the International Space Station.
Liftoff. On the shoulders of Atlas, the SS Deke Slayton II orbital ATK Cygnus spacecraft soars toward the International Space Station.
The first section of the space station was launched in November 1998. 2 years later, the first astronauts came on board, and humans have now been living continuously above the Earth for 15 years.
180 pump speeds and direct pressures are obeying for SNMR.
So, what has the space station achieved in the last 15 years? We'll be hearing about the science carried out on board, both public and private, and asking whether the station has become an important diplomatic outpost for humanity by bridging political divides. I'll also be talking about life, culture, and coffee in space, and asking what happens next.
Maybe starting in a few years, you're going to have 5 programs sending humans to and from low Earth orbit. You'll have the Russians, the Chinese, you have Boeing, SpaceX, and you may have Bezos and his Blue Origin.
I'm at the European Astronaut Center in Cologne, Germany, and this is where we do part of our training for our missions on the International Space Station. There's a deep pool in the building where we do some training for spacewalks, And in the main hall where I am now, there is a full-size training mock-up of the European section of the International Space Station, the Columbus Laboratory. Let's go inside. So I'm climbing through a hatch into Node 2. And so now we climb through the hatch from Node 2 into the Columbus. So in the Columbus mockup, we specifically train for what we call systems. That could be the computers, it could be the thermal control system, it could be the ventilation system, it could be the communication system. When it comes to science, yes, we do have in here some rough replicas, mockups of the science racks. But to do the actual training, we have much higher fidelity facilities in the boots for each one of those scientific racks. On the ISS, of course, I would be floating, so some things in space are actually on the ceiling, for example, but to be able to train for them on the ground, we prefer to put them on the sidewalls, although in space they might be on the ceiling. Now that it's complete, the main purpose of the space station is for scientific research. There are 3 laboratories on the station: Europe's Columbus, the Japanese Kibo Laboratory, and the American Destiny Laboratory.
Moving slowly.
Wow, that's very slow.
2,000. 4,000. 5,000. We're good.
American astronaut Katie Coleman has spent a total of over 6 months on board the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. A scientist, she performed a number of experiments and also operated the robotic arm.
And Houston Station, HTV capture is complete.
Stand up.
Great job, you guys, Paolo, Katie, and Scott, on the morning's work. Congratulations to all of you, and congratulations to the HTV flight control team. Great work today.
My background is in polymer science and engineering, or plastics chemistry kinds of things. And I did do some experiments in that, but all of us are, in a way, a sort of jack of all trades. And the experiments that we all do range from combustion, because things happen sort of quietly or, very, very effortlessly in that microgravity environment. It really gives us a chance to study combustion, how pollution is formed, how soot is formed, how to burn things more efficiently. We grow crystals, which grow not necessarily larger, but more perfectly up there. And that allows us a lens or a window into what materials could look like if they weren't limited by gravity down here. And it allows us to, for example, design drugs for diseases using protein crystal growth. And the last thing that I actually really love is that we get to see, what do liquids really want to do? And it's important down here on Earth, and that's why we study it up in space. It's just in space, we get to see, without gravity, what they want to do so that we can make them behave the way we want down here on Earth. It involves every process that is flow through a pipe, every factory, including actually ourselves, our bodies. We have, veins and blood flowing through our pipes as well. So understanding those dynamics is so hard without being able to understand the tiny forces. And those are the exact things that we can see up in space without gravity.
As astronauts, we work with scientists on the ground to perform their experiments in orbit. One of these is Matthias Sperl, who works for the German Aerospace Center, DLR. He designs some of the experiments for the space station, including one that I did as part of the flying classroom. My experiment was with M&Ms, colorful coated chocolate candies. And I put them in a Ziploc and then later in a transparent sphere, and I shook them, and then I observed them as they came to rest. So Matthias, how did you come up with the idea?
The idea came to us very naturally because we are dealing with granular materials that we try to understand. And one of the things that granular materials do different from like the atoms in the room is that when they collide off each other, they lose energy. So they bounce off each other with a slower velocity than if they come into it. And we tried to do that on the space station with stuff that was already there. And the easiest to use for that experiments was food items.
What did you learn from this experiment?
What you did on the space station was actually the first long-time granular gas experiment. We call it granular gas when particles only collide very infrequently. There's plenty of simulations and theory we do, but only on the space station you have couple minutes where you can really look at the physics going on. So this experiment that you did up there allows us to cross-check if our theories are correct. And this forms the basis of getting the equations right. And the aggregation of dust particles to form early stages of planet formation is a direct application or a direct thing we learned from that seemingly very simple experiment on the space station.
Much of the research on the station is carried out on the astronauts themselves. Space is really bad for your health. Microgravity means your muscles waste away, bones leach calcium, and even your eyesight suffers. It made me feel stuffy, especially in the first days. I really felt this pressure in my head as fluid shifted from the lower parts of my body towards my upper body.
Research that I love to talk about because it concerns me personally and everyone who has a mother, who I think is all of us, and that is the osteoporosis research. As especially women get older, we tend to lose bone. And that happens to us up on the space station 10 times faster than it happens to a woman who has osteoporosis down here on Earth. In other words, what she loses in a year, I lose in about a month up on the space station if I don't do anything. And we've learned what are the things to do to maintain our bone, to regrow bone, to keep from losing bone. And I'm very proud of that work that we're doing up there, mostly because it leads straight back here to Earth.
The team here is in 9.21 in the EMER 2 book. We're stepping into block 4 to shut down.
An important aspect of living on the space station is communication with the ground. We are up there, we are far away, but we're in constant communication. Antonio Fortunato, who is here with me, he works as a Eurocom, which means that he is the spacecraft communicator in the Columbus flight control team.
And one more request, if you could power on the Node 2 camcorder and point it into the module, that'd be great for SA for the ground team.
So when I was a crew member on ISS, I was in constant contact with the ground, with Houston, with Huntsville for American payloads, with Tsukuba in Japan, sometimes with Moscow, and then, of course, with you guys, you Eurocoms in the Columbus Control Center. So could you elaborate what are you responsible for?
The Columbus Control Center is responsible for all the e-science and the system activities that happen in the Columbus module. We actually interact not just with the ESA crew members, but also with all the other crew members who are assigned to activities in Columbus and to collaborate on ESA science.
So, Antonio, from your perspective, how often does it happen that astronauts forget what they're supposed to do and they need a reminder?
The real answer or the politically correct answer?
Well, tell us both.
There are, of course, times where one of the other parts of a procedure are forgotten and we need to steer the astronaut to the right direction. But in general, it's always minor things and things in the flow of the activity, never big mistakes.
First to enter, Samantha Cristoforetti, the 216th individual to visit the International Space Station, hugging Alexander Samokutyaev and Elena Serova.
Throughout the history of the International Space Station, the station has had a diplomatic role.
Soyuz commander Anton Shkaplerov and then U.S. astronaut Terry Virts, the sixth.
On the station, Russians and Americans work and socialize together every day. Space historian Valerie Neal from the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., says the life on the ISS is a good lesson for us here on Earth.
They've carved out a place in space that is somewhat like the United Nations, and it's not totally apolitical, but it's not bound up in politics. The members of the space agencies and even the astronauts themselves who live and work together in space see the space station as a model for the kinds of cooperation that should be more widely possible here on Earth. And they often say if the former arch rivals for power on planet Earth can collaborate successfully in space, why can adversaries not find ways to collaborate peacefully here on Earth? So I think the International Space Station has become a beacon for what could be possible here on Earth. International partners living and working together peacefully, becoming friends with one another, and staying out of the pressures of politics.
Politically, we have countries that may not be on the same page together, but in terms of the International Space Station, It's very encouraging to me that that is a place where we are together, we put all of our differences aside, and we're doing the right thing on a platform that belongs to all of us.
Range is approximately 3 meters.
I'm astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, and this is A Home in Space on BBC World Service.
The crosshairs and the target are aligned.
So what's life on board the space station actually like? Michael Barrett.
My first impression going aboard was after 2 days in the very small Soyuz. You launched from Baikonur, so I spent time in something a little bit larger than a British telephone box, and all of a sudden you dock with this magnificent station that's like a little floating city in space.
And we have contact and capture docking of the Soyuz TMA-17M with the International Space Station.
And how immense it is looking out of our tiny window and going from a small volume into a large free volume where everybody could have their own module or 2 modules if they wanted. The sheer size of it, I think, was really quite amazing. But I think that common to everybody is as soon as you float to a window, which is looking down at the surface of the Earth, and you see your home planet from that platform, it's just overwhelming.
Hello, and welcome to Node 1, the place on the International Space Station where we have our meals together. And it's also the place we can come mid-afternoon or mid-morning to quickly grab a snack. I did some videos about eating and washing and using the toilet in space because I think everybody is curious about those things. But the main thing, of course, is that we are in weightlessness, so everything floats around. So in terms of using the toilet, you have to figure out something that replaces the effects of gravity. And that something is suction. So before we use the toilet for number 1 or number 2, we have to make sure that we have a fan running and we have airflow going in the right direction. And that's basically the main trick. In terms of washing, well, we don't have a shower or we don't have floating water. That would not be very practical in weightlessness. So we take sponge baths and we can carefully put a little bit of water on our body because it kind of tends to stick to our skin. But then we really have to be careful that not too much water floats away. And when it comes to eating, some of our food is dehydrated, so we actually have to add water to turning into edible food. And sometimes it just comes in pouches that we can heat in a little electric oven and then cut open, and then they're sort of ready-to-eat meals. Or sometimes we have fruit that looks just like it would on Earth. For example, this pouch of dried apple, which I like a lot. I like my coffee. And so on the space station, I drank a lot of it. Most of the time I was up there, it was the instant coffee. However, one day towards the end of my mission, we got a real treat from Earth. I got a real espresso machine from Italy. And so my crewmates and I became the first International Space Station crew to actually brew an espresso in space.
Hi, Mom. It's Jamie. Well, Dad's going to have to do twice the job of...
We don't have a lot of free time up there. For me, my first priority was to talk to my family, which I did every day, I think, except for 3 out of 159. And we would spend actually, quite a while on the phone talking about our day. My son was 10 years old at the time, and we had a series of stories that we were reading. And I found that to be kind of interesting because, after a few days up there and even weeks, there's only, how was your day? How was your day? There's only so much you can kind of say. And by reading stories together, and they were quite adventurous ones, it gave my son and I a way to kind of be together without really having to have something that we talked about. And it was really an important activity to me. I didn't take any musical instruments with me, but many astronauts are musical. And Chris Hadfield caused a sensation when he recorded a video of himself singing a David Bowie song on the space station.
Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom. Lock your Soyuz hatch and put your helmet on.
Crew getting to go from Mission Control Houston to open the airlock door. It's the crew lock now already down to vacuum. You can see the protective cover opening up.
External maintenance of the space station involves a spacewalk, also known as an extravehicular activity, or EVA.
Don't be shy with pushing me around whatever you need me.
For European astronaut Luca Parmitano, what should have been a straightforward EVA in July 2013 almost became a tragedy. after a water leak in his spacesuit almost caused him to drown in space.
Hey, Luca, can you clarify, is it increasing or not increasing?
It's hard to tell, but it feels like a lot of water.
Well, the moment I felt the water in the back of my head that wasn't supposed to be there, that's when I thought it's time for me to call somebody on the ground and let them know that the suit is not performing as expected. So at the beginning, it wasn't clear that it was potentially dangerous. We thought it was just a nuisance. It would be annoying and I might lose maybe the sound because of water in my ear. But I had a pretty good feeling that it was going to be a problem when the water covered my eyes and my nose.
All right, Chris and Luca, just for you guys, based on what we heard with Lucas saying that water is in his eyes now and it seems to be increasing, we think we're going to terminate EVA case for EV2. So, Luca, we'll have you head back to the airlock. Chris, we'll get a plan for you to clean things up here and then join him here in a minute.
This was the first time it ever happened, and hopefully it will be the last time it ever happened. And so we had no idea that something like this could even happen. So we didn't have an emergency procedure for this sort of happening. However, we are trained to react to emergency procedures of a different nature that require our immediate re-entry inside the space station. So what is important in that case is to be able to navigate yourself and your suit safely back to the airlock. And that was what really saved my life, the fact that the instructors trained me on the ground, underwater, to know the spacecraft well, to be able to basically navigate in the blind, because I wasn't able to see anything. I had water in my eyes and it was night, which in space, night means absolute darkness.
Hatches open, Shane. Lucas going to the crew lock.
Copy, Chris. Thanks.
In emergency, any kind of emergency, whether you're flying an airplane or floating in space or driving a car, I think that the best way to react is always to concentrate on the solution rather than the problem.
You can see some of the water floating away that had built up inside of Luca's helmet. Helmet off and Luca safely back inside.
Luca's experience proves once again that we should never take space for granted. Living and working in space is challenging and requires attention and careful preparation. So what about the future of the ISS? So far, most partners have agreed to keep the space station operational until 2024. Valerie Neal, who studied the history of the space station, believes it may last longer.
It remains to be seen what the long-term future of the International Space Station is. I think that the partners have committed it to be operational at least through 2020 to 2025, as well as it's operating now. There may be a push to look at another 5-year increment. So I think the future to 2030 is probably likely.
But not everyone's convinced. Jeffrey Menber from NanoRex.
We're reaching a point now where I am an advocate of a firm end date. It's like a guest in your house that you're not sure when they're going to leave. Do you bring out more food? Do you serve the tea? When is the International Space Station going to come down? I am one who advocates that if the private sector can step up in the next year or two, that 2024 should be a firm date.
There are 2 major space nations, India and China, not currently involved in the ISS. Although NanoRex does fly a Chinese experiment, Jeffrey Menber believes the International Space Station will be the last of its kind.
Well, it's starting now. You have Bigelow Aerospace wishes to do their own station. I think you'll have major aerospace players having their own stations. And NanoRex will be there with its own station. What do I mean by that? Well, maybe starting in a few years, you're going to have 5 programs sending humans to and from low Earth orbit. You'll have the Russians, the Chinese, you have Boeing, SpaceX, and you may have Bezos and his Blue Origin. Okay, you're going to have some hotels for space tourists. Will we do that? I don't know. Maybe Space Adventures will do that. Maybe Boeing will do that. You'll have research platforms. You'll have unmanned platforms. We're looking at the full range now. But the exciting thing is you won't have a government facility. We'll have launch vehicles going. Some will be manned. Some will be cargo. They may just visit all of the stations. Some will be, let's say you'll have 3 American stations. Maybe you'll have a Russian station. Maybe the Chinese will join us. And we can thereby make use of their facilities and their launch vehicles. For me, what's exciting is it will be the beginning of a robust marketplace. I believe you cannot consider going to Mars or the moon. You cannot consider practically doing more than the initial steps of exploration without having a marketplace in space.
It is huge, like a mountain or a skyscraper, but also huge like the wheel, the atom, penicillin, and electricity.
Из космоса.
With 14 pressurized modules involving 15 nations, the International Space Station has been an immense undertaking. As a feat of engineering alone, it's a testament to humanity's skills and ambition. Every day, countries work together in orbit.
And all the great minds still to come.
David Baker.
I hope that the current international partnership will continue over the next several decades. It's a good platform for continuing beyond Earth orbit. I think there are doubts as to whether it can, over decades, hold together in the way it has. That is in the fate of future political decisions. But I think it's a great starting point. At some point, there is going to be the emergence of nations, China and India, who aspire to be part of this. And I would hope that they can be part of the International Space Station eventually, and that we can all together work to take humans on the next great adventure, which is hopefully to put boots on Mars.
So, has it lived up to its original promise, an inspiring outpost above the Earth? Well, I really think so. Just imagine that anybody listening now who is less than 15 years old has never lived a single day of their lives without a human being flying above them in space. But I'm not the only one who believes it's been a success. Many skeptics have changed their minds. Even the UK is now on board and is supporting human spaceflight.
My name is Tim Peake and I'm a British astronaut with the European Space Agency. We're only going to extend the space station till 2024. And beyond that, I would expect to see future space stations in low Earth orbit being purely commercial ventures, with commercial rockets carrying science and astronauts to those space stations. And I would see the national space agencies working together, international collaboration continuing on a lunar exploration project, looking ahead eventually to a Mars exploration project.
Can you
So, to those who have been closely involved with the International Space Station, after all the investment, the human endeavor, the triumphs and the tragedies, has it all been worth it?
I think the consensus is that the International Space Station has been a diplomatic success, a technological success, an aspirational success.
I think that we've built two things. We've built a magnificent station, and we've built an international community that knows exactly how to work together. I think we've stabilized the world. I think you've got Cold War adversaries that are now working together in space and can't imagine working any other way.
The thing that I'm probably most proud of at this very moment is really the difference that it makes down here on Earth. The fact that we needed to learn how to grow plants in a place where we're resource poor. Well, it's a very similar problem to down here on Earth, and we learned a lot about how to grow plants under those conditions, and that leads to solutions to world hunger.
It has been a great model for which countries can come together and work alongside each other and understand each other, and it is a great place from which people can launch out from Earth orbit to map the solar system and journey to the planets together rather than nationalistically for political ends.
I'm an astronaut. For me, the space station is an important achievement. It is living proof of what our planet can produce when it collaborates and works together. It crosses international boundaries, and when you look down from the space station's cupola like I did, you don't see any international boundaries either. We are all on this planet together, and the space station is helping people on Earth through its scientific experiments and the promise of an exciting future on the Moon, Mars, and beyond.
Station, this is Houston ACR. Thank you. That concludes our event.
I'm Samantha Cristoforetti. The producers of A Home in Space are Sue Nelson and Richard Hollingham. And this has been a Boffin Media production for BBC World Service. Thanks for listening.
BBC station, we are now resuming operational audio communication.
Thanks for listening. Find more interviews, features and documentaries at bbcworldservice.com/space.